The real limits of government, a constitutional framework for protecting fundamental rights. The government's authority is inherently limited by the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, which exists to safeguard the natural and unalienable rights of individuals. Any action or statute that compels individuals to trade their fundamental rights for privileges without voluntary and informed consent violates the foundational principles of liberty and justice enshrined in the Constitution. The dichotomy between rights and privileges. Fundamental rights, such as the right to travel, are inherent and protected under constitutional provisions, including the Privileges and Immunities Clause and the Due Process Clause. These rights are not granted by the government, but are recognized as pre-existing and inviolable. Right to travel. The right to travel freely on public roads is a fundamental liberty. Courts, including in Thompson v. Smith, have affirmed that this right cannot be arbitrarily infringed or diminished under the guise of regulation. Unconstitutional conditions. Conditioning the exercise of these rights on compliance with licensing or fees contravenes the principle that fundamental rights are beyond government control. Privileges, such as the operation of commercial enterprises or the use of public infrastructure for profit, are regulated by the state under its police powers. These privileges are granted, not inherent, and may be subject to reasonable restrictions for public safety and welfare. The government's missteps, coercion through licensing. The historical roots of transportation law demonstrate a clear distinction between commercial activities, which are privileges regulated under the Commerce Clause, and non-commercial travel, which is a protected right. Over time, however, the government has blurred these lines by treating private non-commercial travel as though it were commercial in nature, imposing licensing and registration requirements universally, thereby coercing individuals into surrendering their rights for privileges. This overreach violates Murdoch v. Pennsylvania, which holds that the government cannot require a license or fee to exercise a constitutional right, Marbury v. Madison, which established that any law repugnant to the Constitution is void. Consent, the cornerstone of legitimacy. Government power derives from the consent of the governed. For consent to be valid, it must be informed. Citizens must understand the nature and implications of the agreement. Voluntary. Consent must be given freely, without coercion or duress. Optional. Citizens must retain the ability to decline the exchange of rights for privileges and still exercise their inherent rights. When the government mandates compliance with licensing schemes for the exercise of rights, it undermines the principles of voluntary consent and infringes on individual sovereignty. Constitutional boundaries, the real limits of government commerce versus non-commercial use. The government has a legitimate interest in regulating commerce to ensure public safety and infrastructure integrity. However, this authority does not extend to regulating non-commercial activities, such as private travel. Judicial precedents. Court rulings that uphold licensing requirements are exclusively tied to commercial contexts, where the operation of vehicles for hire or profit directly impacts public welfare. Conversely, rulings affirming the right to travel unequivocally protect personal, non-commercial use of public roads. Police powers. While the state may enact regulations to promote safety, such regulations must not infringe upon fundamental rights. The use of police powers must be narrowly tailored and justified by compelling state interests. Unconstitutional overreach. Any law or policy that conflates rights with privileges, compelling citizens to trade one for the other, is unconstitutional. This principle is anchored in the doctrines established by cases like Murdoch v. Pennsylvania and the broader constitutional framework. Restoring constitutional order. To uphold liberty and justice, it is essential to reaffirm the right to travel. The right to travel must remain inviolate. Regulations must clearly distinguish between commercial and non-commercial use of public roads. Challenge unconstitutional conditions. Citizens must have the ability to challenge laws that condition the exercise of rights on compliance with licensing or fees. Courts must strictly scrutinize such statutes to ensure alignment with constitutional principles. Educate and inform. Citizens must understand the difference between rights and privileges to effectively assert their liberties. The conflation of these concepts undermines individual sovereignty and perpetuates governmental overreach. Conclusion. The Constitution imposes strict limits on government power to ensure the protection of fundamental rights. The right to travel, as an inherent liberty, cannot be transformed into a privilege through coercive licensing schemes. The government's role is to regulate commerce, not to encroach on personal freedoms. Upholding this distinction is essential to preserving the balance between liberty and governance. As citizens, it is our duty to assert our rights, challenge unconstitutional overreach, and educate ourselves and others about the real limits of government. Only through vigilance and understanding can we ensure that our liberties remain intact for future generations.
Sovereign, him give me the key. Me now bow to Babylon, just set me free. On that your law, me rights them pure. In the courtroom, me heart secure. Yeah, Jah are the only sovereign, him give me the key. Me stand firm, Jah guide me destiny. Him sovereign, I in me serve. Me live for Jah.